Wednesday, April 5th, we're going to talk about the legality and ethics of emulation and ROMs today. The goal behind this series is basically to put out some feelers into to the viewers that are out there and say on Sunday at the end of the news wrap up, I'm going to talk about this sort of topic. Put in your comments. We'll try and talk a little bit about what some of the people have to say on the topic of conversation. So again, emulation and ROMs, but both the legal side and the ethical side. Now, I got to start off by saying I am not a lawyer. Do not take any of this for legal advice. I'm just somebody that reads a lot, and I've done a lot of research on this stuff. And so I want to actually start off with one of the comments that we had from a Gleep von Reticuli saying that emulation is great. The preservation of old games is very important. The only good way to do so is digitize them and spread the files as much as possible without any form of DRM protection. Cartridges will eventually break down, and I do not trust private companies for doing the job of preserving these games. Now, here's the thing. Preservation, in legal terms, actually has a very specific definition. And when you're talking about the idea of spreading the digitized files around as a way of preserving things, and this is actually a problem. You are not an archive. You are not a library. You are not a nonprofit organization in the business of preserving data. This is an issue when you take a look into the legality side of emulation and what emulation is all about. Now, emulation takes two things. You're going to have two pieces of this puzzle in order to actually go ahead and get something running. You need an emulator and you need a ROM. The ROM is the piece of software, the game, the artwork, all of that kind of stuff. And the emulator is the program that runs it. Now, emulators are totally legal most of the time. And the reason why they're totally legal is that they're a program that maybe me, if I was a coder, I could write an emulator. I don't have to use any proprietary code that is in the original software. If I'm going to write an emulator for the Wii, I don't necessarily have to use any code that Nintendo wrote when they constructed that device. So if I write my own program that can do a certain job, I even get to maintain my own copyright on that code. So the emulator itself, the functional software, is totally fine. The other side of the coin is the ROM, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. Now, the part about emulators that you have to be a bit cautious of is that in some cases, you do have some sort of proprietary tech that's involved in what the emulator is doing. And this does cause a bit of concern. There was another person that had talked about something as well, asking, it was a question relating to, let me find it here real quick because I've lost it. Nemo Nakoi asking for an opinion on the fact that Dolphin, which is an emulator for the Wii, is able to connect to the eShop, and you can actually purchase games from Nintendo inside the emulator. This throws me into all kinds of realms of uncomfortable that makes me really, really concerned, because how are they authenticating that? How are they doing that without having used some sort of proprietary information? Worries me just a little bit. But as far as the legality of emulation itself, it's a lot like BitTorrent, right? BitTorrent itself is just a transfer mechanism. It's a way of doing a thing, transferring a file from one place to another. In and of itself, BitTorrent doesn't actually do any illegal things at all. The issue comes when you're talking about the actual content itself that is going to be transferred from one place to another. So let's take a look at your basic idea of a ROM, right? A ROM is a prepackaged piece of intellectual property. I've taken a game, maybe it was an old Nintendo cartridge, maybe it was an old Upright Arcade game, maybe it was a PlayStation 4 disc. I don't know if there's any that are really successful on emulating that kind of stuff yet, but any of these things, these are quote-unquote ROMs. And that's just sort of a holdover from the original cartridge base stuff. That's the name that it was used. The ROM is a bit of a problem. And whether or not a ROM is legal actually depends on where you are. But not just whether or not a ROM is legal, but how you got it changes, or the legal side of this changes quite a bit. So there are a lot of places around the world where you are allowed, under copyright law, you're allowed to back up your own stuff, right? So usually if you look at the law, it's talking about things like music and DVDs, stuff like that. And you'll see the phrase format shifting out there in the wild. And that's what we're talking about. The idea of taking something and turning it into a different format than it was originally intended to be used at, right? So if you take something like, for example, an old Nintendo cartridge, and you turn that into a digital file that's going to run on an emulator on a computer, you have format shifted the game into a different format. And there are some places in the world where this is a perfectly legal way of backing up your own stuff. In Canada, for example, this is something you can do. In the United States and the UK, this is not something that you can do. You're not allowed. Now, unless something's changed in the UK recently, but in my own research over this one, format shifting is still a problem. Right? It's very much an issue. And if you take a look at some place like Australia, you're allowed to format shift in Australia, but only if there's no DRM. And technically, the format shifting only covers the software, not the art assets. So if you do a video game format shift in Australia, yeah, your software part of that is totally fine, but you're not allowed to copy the assets because that's copyright infringement. How ridiculous is that? Absolute nonsense. And again, apologies for the raspy throat. I've been feeling under the weather the last few days. So to read through another comment that came in on this particular topic, Orthonics from Patreon. If the piracy of any game, no matter how old, affects the sale of a company, then it is piracy, then is it piracy if the game in question is not being officially sold anymore, nor is the hardware to support it discounted or discontinued, I imagine is the intended wording. Don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that Nintendo or the original developer is not making any money off of secondhand sales of a game like Hagain for the SNES. So basically the idea talking about abandonware, right? Discontinued products, things that are not available anymore. Is the ROM, is the prepackaged to be emulated piece of software something that is piracy, or is it legal if it's something that is not sold anymore? And the fact of the matter, unfortunately, for those that like to archive their games, is that, it's still piracy. The fact that a company has chosen to not continue to sell it or chosen not to put it on other platforms, that doesn't matter. Just because it's been around for a while and been on a different platform and now you can't find it anymore, that doesn't matter. To give a comparable example, if I make a video, let's say I'm not really fond of that video. I own the video, so I have the right to take that video offline and say that this is not something that anybody is allowed to watch. I'm going to take this away from people. It's my creative production, and I have that right. I'm allowed to do that. Game companies are no different, right? If they've produced a product and they wish to not have that product be something that's on sale anymore, they're well within their right to take that away, even through their own inaction. That doesn't actually change things, right? Just because they're not selling it anymore, it doesn't allow people to just do whatever they want with these products. Take a sip here. I'm getting dry. Oh, so where were we? Well, format shifting. Back to the format shifting piece. You're dealing with, at this point, basic copyright law. There are, again, sometimes you have a fair use exemption, for the purposes of archiving and those sorts of things. But the problem is, in most jurisdictions, copyright law talks about those with a specific entity in mind. They're talking about a registered archival institution or a library. They're talking about educational institutions. They're talking about these sorts of things, right? What we're looking for in copyright law when we're talking about emulation and personal backup is clauses that talk about personal use. And this is where ROMs really start to get kind of finicky. To read another quick comment and kind of keep this train of thought going, Svartscamp on Patreon saying, like a table you buy at IKEA, you own that table, which you can sell and modify any way you see fit, right? Judges in the past have judged that digital products like this, the cases of theft have been handled on RuneScape items, or that a full Steam library should be transferable from one person to another. And there's a certain amount of ownership involved in the ROMs that we're talking about. And where it comes to that ownership and that being able to back up your own thing, there are a lot of protections in copyright law in some places that talk about exactly that. In Canada, right? This is my example, that you can format shift in Canada to back up for your own personal use. But the problem there gets even more hairy. You have to back it up yourself. That's the rule. You find me any location where they allow you to format shift, where they allow you to have a backup of something that you own. The rule 99 times out of 100 is going to be, yep, you can do that so long as you back it up yourself. That means that just because I have a copy of Super Mario 3 on the Nintendo, I can't go download a ROM. I have to back this up myself. I have to get the knowledge and the tools required to make that backup myself. So the entire online ROM community is distributing pirated software. That's the end line of the legal side of this. That's the ultimate point. If I had to make an overarching point to all of this, is that the online ROM community is illegal. Bar none, end of story, period. That's how it is. Because there are no locations that say, as long as you own it, you're allowed to have a backup of it. They say, as long as you own it, you're allowed to make a backup of it. The moment you download that backup, you have now pirated that game, even though you technically have the original copy. And so technically, it would be very easy to prove, as we've seen, even with Nintendo of all places, if you have a downloaded ROM from somewhere online and you have a copy of that game on your shelf, if someone were to ever, for some reason, take you to court, they can take a look at that ROM file and figure out who made it, because chances are they've got a copy of that ROM file they downloaded from somewhere online too. They can compare your ROM file against one that somebody else made, and it's going to come out to be identical. Bit for bit, byte for byte. Whereas if you did the ROM backup yourself, chances are it'd be a little bit different. See, for Nintendo, they did this exact thing. There's a copy of, I believe it was the original Super Mario Brothers. Now, I could be wrong. It might have been one of the other sequels afterwards. But the version of the ROM that they sell on their eShop is a ripped ROM that was created by somebody and distributed online. And the way that we figured that out is somebody took a look in the ROM file and found the header, which has a very specific workaround to allow it to work on the computer with one of the NES emulators. And it's something that nobody would ever have just by accident happened to do exactly the same way. So Nintendo effectively is selling somebody else's pirated ROM on their eShop. How interesting is that, right? Absolute crazy, crazy, crazy nonsense. One of the other things that Svar talked about had to do with Nintendo, and they have a certain amount of really, really heavy policy on their terms of service and things like that, talking about all emulation is illegal and terrible and awful and this horrible stuff, and yet then they sell a couple of emulated copies. It's just very bizarre, the stance that some of these companies have. But at the end of the day, that's really the truth of the matter. The end line of all of the legal side is that emulation is okay. ROMs, unless you make them yourself, not okay. Now, how likely you're going to get caught? Well, it's a bit of a different story, I suppose. The last thing that I wanted to talk about on the legal side, and I'm sure this one's going to get, this video is going to be actually quite a bit longer than I originally intended. I wanted to talk about CEMU, or CEMU, right? So this is the Wii U emulator. A lot of people have asked me fairly recently about what they're doing, because they're basically allowing people to play the new Zelda game without having to pay for the system to play the new Zelda game on, or pay for the Zelda game itself. And so the question becomes, what is CEMU doing that is legal, and what are they doing that's not? All they're doing is creating an emulator that runs software, right? That's really the crux of it. So chances are CEMU itself, the emulator, unless they're using copyrighted code, is probably legal by itself. The thing itself. What worries me about CEMU, and what I think we might see if they start to get any more traction and Nintendo really notices them, they have a problem. And that problem is that they are using pirated content, effectively, or rather copyrighted content without permission, without any fair use protections, to advertise their product and get themselves up to about $40,000 a month, a little bit under 40,000. I checked it just before the stream, on Patreon. So Nintendo could, in very short order, probably destroy CEMU and destroy the lives of the people that are making it. Because what you have is you have copyright infringement, an active advertised use of copyright infringement with a genuine dollar value at the end that they can actually prove. And that's a huge problem. That's something that Nintendo could really cause some issues for CEMU with. And yeah, they're up to $40,000 now. I imagine their more recent videos talking about how Breath of the Wild is basically, getting close to playable. You're going to see that number jump even further. Pretty scary stuff. So that's the legal side. Now, onto the ethical side. Well, the ethical side, of course, is much more gray, right? I mean, the legal side, very black and white. Emulators, fine. ROMs, if you make it yourself, okay. As long as the copyright law in your country says you're allowed to do personal backups, great. If you download it online, straight piracy. Period. End of story. That's emulation and ROMs on the legal side. On the ethical side, from an unnamed Patreon backer, asked not to be called out directly, saying, I'm so sick of nostalgia bait, be it half-assed reboots, overpriced buggy mobile ports, exploitive mobile games branded with all the things we loved as kids, etc. Sell me my old games in all their glory for a fair price. Keep your stupid subscription models, time limits, microtransaction-riddled mobile games, and all your other greedy bullshit. And this boils back to what Gabe Newell said quite a while ago now, actually, when talking about piracy, relating it to Steam. Piracy is a service problem. ROMs are a service problem. They're a sales problem. Right? We have this enormous community that has figured out precisely how to take a game on the Nintendo Entertainment System, Super Mario Brothers, Duck Hunt, Super C, pick your poison, it doesn't matter. And you can run it on the computer. How much money do you think they would make if they just put out their own emulator and their own store and sold these games themselves? Like the sheer arrogance of, we're not going to bother with any of that kind of stuff, and we're going to sell you, in the case of the Nintendo Switch, you sign up for our subscription service and you're going to get one game for a month, and then we're going to take it away and give you a different. Why not sell the game, for $3 a pop, $2 a pop. Pick your poison. Doesn't matter. Any of those old NES games. Make the Super NES games $5. Make the GameCube games and the Xbox games and the PS2 games $7 or $8. PS3, Xbox 360, $10. Right? When you start to get into the more current stuff, have a nice little sliding scale. Charge for them, but charge fair. Give people the games that they don't have to worry about losing later on. It's absolutely a service problem. The amount of money lost because companies have not bothered to get into emulation properly. And we're starting to see this now in the current console generation. Right? Both Microsoft and Sony are getting into this big time by trying to say, okay, well, we're going to build emulators into our current gen consoles because we know that there's a ton of old games, and we're going to give you a subscription service and you get whatever games that you want to play during that time. And that's better. I don't know that it's as good as just outright, let me buy the goddamn digital file and let me play it myself. And I don't need server checks and I don't need this and that and the other. Just let me buy it. Let me have it properly. Let me have it legally. That would be absolutely fantastic. So the next part of the ethics debate, honestly has an awful lot to do with the likelihood that you're going to run into an issue. And this actually comes back a little bit to the discontinued and the abandonware and some of that stuff. From the Real Trackard on YouTube, in my opinion, the only reason someone should be worried about their ethical use of emulation is because they've downloaded a game that is readily available legally and for a reasonable price. Imagine needing to keep an old computer around your house just to play old DOS games like Doom instead of using something like DOSBox. The way I see it, the reason Nintendo's against emulation is because they have the most to lose, and they know they can't compete. So further on, he's talking about the idea of, why would I want to buy a copy of Super Mario World on the Wii and then go over to the Wii U and not be able to purchase or not be able to play it? It doesn't make sense. Why would the consumer want to do any of that kind of stuff? Why would we want to pay for something twice? And it's just simply because the companies aren't thinking about it in that way. They're not thinking from the customer perspective. They're just looking at it and saying, oh, hey, well, we have this old game. Let's resell it again. But the likelihood of the issue part comes into play with a lot of games that are not sold anymore. So if you go back to the old NES and SNES and all of that, there is a little bit of a problem around who owns the license for certain games. And I don't have any that I can just kind of pull off the top of my head, right? I mean, that things like Castlevania belong to Konami. What are the chances that Konami is going to try and go back and do ROMs for an old game system that nobody's buying anymore when they're focused on slot machines, right? Obviously, this is something that just isn't going to happen. And if they're also not worrying about it and they're not even entering into that space, the chances that you're going to have a problem downloading a Castlevania ROM is pretty limited, right? Pretty low chance of there being any problems there. The same with a lot of abandonware titles, especially with companies that have gone out of business, right? You look at something like, without knowing that Beamdog was a company that was dealing with the old Baldur's Gate games and things like that, I'd have to do some research to try to figure out who owned the Baldur's Gate license, right? Is it something that just reverted to Wizards of the Coast, or did it sort of evaporate with Interplay, right? For those old games. I'm not talking about more recent D&D games, but you run into a lot of those problems, and the question about abandonware, and a lot of people say, well, if it's not being sold, I can totally do it. Well, okay, just because it's not being sold doesn't mean that nobody owns it, right? That kind of goes back to my earlier point about if I choose not to sell something, that doesn't give you the right to take it and run off with it. Now, from an ethical perspective, there's a little bit more weight there, right? I can't buy this game legally. I can't give you money for it because there's no way, right? The system that it was sold on is so old and you have never put up a new version of it that the only way that I can play this game is go on eBay and spend $500 for an old system that works and another $100 or $200 for the game and hope that I'm going to get one that actually functions. So you run into that a lot. You run into the likelihood that you're gonna actually have an issue with this along the way. To go with another comment, Nathan Gatton saying, I believe that the emulation of old video games is justified for two reasons. Or more correctly, I think he means under two circumstances. If there is no way to financially support the original developers and preservation. Right? Old console games and their consoles themselves, these are starting to disintegrate, and many consoles are near impossible to maintain, and the original code for some games are lost. And he's not wrong. I agree with that. Except, I don't buy the argument. He's right. He's absolutely correct. If there's no way to financially support the developers, and I'm going to change his wording slightly and say the developers that own the license, not the original ones, because the original ones probably sold it to someone else. But preservation is definitely a valuable thing. And this is where I run into my own ethical quandaries on emulation and ROMs. I think from an ethical perspective, I'm kind of okay with it. I think, generally speaking, you know what? If you can't buy it, and this is the only way you can actually experience that game, then great. But what I don't buy, and what bothers me the most about this whole thing, is the bullshit argument of the gamer who is the person preserving the game. This comes back to very similar to the way that people argue about BitTorrent. And people are saying, oh, BitTorrent is totally legit. You shouldn't shut down the Pirate Bay because BitTorrent has nothing wrong with BitTorrent and nothing wrong with the Pirate Bay. They're just pointers. They just point to things that other people do. And it's the things the other people do that are illegal. And I'm totally a legit user. I only get ROMs of games that I own. Bullshit. You're a fucking liar and you know it. Don't hand me that crap. This is the issue with ROMs, is that the argument is a lie for 95% of people that play ROMs. I'm going to say I pulled the 95% out of my ass, but I don't care. Okay. Nobody is following that rule. Nobody's looking at their shelf and saying, oh, hey, I've got 3 Nintendo Entertainment System games. I'm going to go get ROMs for just those 3 games. Of course not. You're going to download way more than that. Don't lie to me. That's garbage. It's the same thing with BitTorrent. It's the same thing with all of these different avenues. It is a false argument trying to play off of the, sort of a pedantic knowledge of the law that you found online and saying, oh, well, yeah, I totally do this. Absolutely. Right. Okay. And I've never pirated a program before. Back when I was in university, I'm sure that I was probably in the $40,000 or $50,000 worth of pirated software that I had been responsible for myself personally. Everything from 3D Studio Max to AutoCAD. I had operating systems. I had everything. And university, this is like cable and DSL was still not really a thing at that point. This is early piracy, man. This is the beginnings of a lot of this shit. This is Usenet and other nonsense for me. I'm responsible for a lot of piracy. Not anymore. I've changed. I found that it was very hard to square. It was right around the time I was working at BioWare in QA. It was really, really hard to square, and I started to feel bad for something that I had never felt bad before in my entire life. I never cared about piracy. I never cared about stealing software. I couldn't afford it. Whatever. I'm going to pirate the game instead. And the moment that I worked in the game industry, the moment that I knew that piracy actually hurt, is kind of when that changed for me. And I was still, you know what? After I was done at BioWare, yep, there were still a couple of things. I pay for my stuff now. I absolutely do. I have a wonderful license for the Adobe suite. I went and I bought Windows 10 because I missed out on getting it for free when they were giving it away. There is one exception, though, before I close up. And I have felt bad about this for, I'm going to say a decade. Nobody pays for WinRAR. And I probably should. One of these days, you know what? If I had to pick a piece of software that is the software I have used the most and for the longest period of time without ever paying for it, it's definitely WinRAR. Anyways, thank you very much for tuning in to the Feedback Loop. The way that this is going to work is that this will go up for the people on Patreon as soon as the stream is over. I'm going to try and get that done tonight. If not tonight, then tomorrow. After that, it will go up on the channel on Saturday for everybody else to watch. And what I would love to have you do, if you can for me, is in the comments. Again, feel free to comment on emulation and ROMs and all of this sort of stuff. But in the comments, I also want to hear some topics that are going to be good for the next feedback loop that'll be on Wednesday next week, assuming that all goes well. And then on Sunday, we'll take some comments on whatever that topic is. I'll announce it at the end of the news wrap-up. So thank you very much for watching. And I'm going to get myself back into some Dark Souls here. And yeah, cheers. It's a good ending, I guess. I don't know. Losing my mind over here. And I'm sure, absolutely sure that Dark Souls has crashed. Oh my God, it's still there. Look at this. So I do have to apologize to folks that maybe it did crash.